My uncle owned a small fishing cabin in upstate New York, perched right on the edge of a remote lake. It wasn't the biggest or fanciest place, but to my cousin Danny and me, it was heaven. Every summer, we'd spend weeks hiking through the woods, fishing off the dock, and swimming in the lake's dark, cool waters. But after the summer of 2019, I never went back. And I never will. That summer, everything seemed normal at first. The cabin was the same as always. Musty wooden floors, old fishing gear stacked in the corner, and my uncle's collection of weird trinkets from his travels. We arrived on a Friday evening, and by the next morning, we were already out on the lake paddling in my uncle's old canoe. The water stretched out for miles, surrounded by dense, towering pines. The lake was deep, so deep that even in the brightest daylight, the bottom was impossible to see. On our second day, we met an old man at the tiny bait shop near the highway. He was a local, dressed in worn-out flannel and a dirty cap, sitting on a stool like he had nowhere else to be. When we told him where we were staying, his expression changed. "Don't go out on the lake after dark," he muttered. Danny and I exchanged glances. "Why not?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just don't." My uncle chuckled, brushing it off. "Local legends," he said as we left. "They say the lake's haunted or cursed. You know how small towns are." Danny and I were both intrigued, but we didn't think much of it. Not until the night everything changed. It was our second to last night at the cabin. We had just finished roasting marshmallows by the fire, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and pine. The lake was unusually calm, almost unnaturally so. The wind had died, and the surface was like black glass, reflecting the moon in eerie stillness. Danny turned to me with a grin. "One last canoe ride?" I hesitated. Something about the stillness felt wrong. But I didn't want to be the coward. "Yeah, why not?" We grabbed our life jackets and pushed off from the dock. The canoe cut through the water soundlessly, carrying us further into the dark. The glow from the cabin's porch light faded behind us until we were just two figures drifting in the vast blackness. For a while it was peaceful, just the soft creak of the canoe and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Then we heard it. A splash. Not a small one. This was heavy like something large had dropped into the water. Danny stiffened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. My stomach tightened. He clicked on the flashlight and shined it toward the shore. The trees stood silent, motionless. Nothing there. Then another splash. Closer. This time I saw something. A shape just beneath the surface, barely visible. It wasn't a fish, it wasn't a log, it was something else. Then it moved. Danny gasped. What the hell was that? The shape shifted, rising, just enough for me to make out were two long pale arms. Reaching toward our canoe, Danny screamed, "Paddle!" We didn't think, we just moved. Our paddles cut through the water in frantic strokes, the canoe rocking dangerously. I risked one last glance over my shoulder and saw it. A face koi breaking the surface. Not human, not even close. Its skin was sickly pale, almost translucent. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were just dark. Hollows out in a featureless face, and its mouth, stretched far too wide, gaped open in a silent scream. Then, as if it had no bones, it lunged. The canoe tilted violently as something hit the bottom from below. Water sloshed over the sides. I nearly lost my grip on the paddle. "Almost there," Danny shouted. The dock was coming into view. We paddled harder, arms burning, hearts slamming against our ribs. Just as we reached the dock, something had grabbed the canoe. A long, clawed hand burst from the water, gripping the side of the boat with impossible strength. The wood groaned under its grasp. I screamed. Danny grabbed an oar and swung it down hard. The thing let out a hideous, inhuman screech and released its grip. We scrambled onto the dock, breathless and shaking. The lake had gone still again, as if nothing had ever happened. We ran inside, bolted the doors, and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, we told my uncle what we saw. I expected him to laugh, to say it was just our imaginations. Instead, his face went pale. He stared at us for a long moment, then muttered something under his breath. Something about old stories and things better left alone. Then he said the one thing I'll never forget. "You boys are lucky, most don't get away." We packed up that afternoon. The entire drive home, my uncle barely spoke. Danny and I never talked about it again. Not really, but sometimes late at night I can still hear the sound of water dripping, and I still see those arms reaching out of the dark water, still waiting. I grew up in a rural part of Nebraska, surrounded by nothing but miles of cornfields and long dirt roads. My family owned a modest farmhouse, passed down through generations, standing alone like an island in a sea of gold. It had always been a peaceful place, until the summer of 2016, when I realized we weren't as alone as we thought. The first signs. It started subtly. Our family had 3 scarecrows, old, tattered things, placed at different corners of our field to keep crows away. My dad had set them up years ago, stuffing their bodies with hay, dressing them in worn-out flannels and ragged overalls. They had always been in the same place, unmoving, lifeless. Then one evening, while driving home from town, I noticed something strange. The scarecrow closest to the road had moved, not fallen, not tilted, but moved, standing in a slightly different position, now facing the road instead of the field. A chill ran through me. Maybe Dad had adjusted it? But that didn't make sense. He never messed with them unless absolutely necessary. The next morning it had moved again. This time it stood even closer, right on the edge of the field facing our house. I felt uneasy, but convinced myself it was the wind or a prank by some local kids. That evening I mentioned it to my dad. His face darkened. "I didn't touch it," he said firmly. Neither had my mom, and with no close neighbors for miles, the mystery deepened. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My window overlooked the fields, and I found myself staring out at the scarecrow. The way it stood, motionless yet watching, sent an unshakable feeling of dread creeping over me. At around 2 a.m., I finally saw it move. Not like a person, not like something walking. It glided between the rows of corn. I sat up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed that it wasn't possible, but there it was, shifting closer. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the field, tilting its head ever so slightly, as if it were watching me. I stumbled out of bed, rushed to wake my dad. He grabbed his rifle, and together we stormed outside, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. But by the time we reached the field's edge, the scarecrow was gone. No footprints. No sign that it had ever been there. The next morning, the second scarecrow was missing too, the whispering in the dark. Over the next few nights, the unease in our house turned into outright terror. We began hearing footsteps in the cornfield. At night, slow, deliberate, crunching movements. My dad stayed up with his rifle, but he never saw anything. Then came the whispers. It started as a soft murmuring outside my window just past midnight. The voices were low, guttural, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. My body froze in place. The whispering got closer and closer, until it was right outside the glass. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. The next morning, we found something worse, footprints circling the house. They weren't human. They were too long, too narrow, and in the center of the prints the last scarecrow stood facing our front door. My dad burned it that afternoon. It didn't stop. We thought that was the end of it. We were wrong. The following night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my bedroom window. I lay there, paralyzed, heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I turned my head. The glass was fogged with breath, and beyond it, barely visible in the dim moonlight, a shape, tall, thin, not human. Its head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, just like the scarecrow, and its hands, if you could call them that, had long spindly fingers tapping slowly, deliberately against the window pane. I must have screamed, because the next thing I knew, my dad was bursting into my room with his rifle, my mom close behind him. But by the time we looked out the window, the thing was gone. Only a deep, hollow imprint in the dirt below remained. That was the final straw. The escape. We packed up and left that summer, abandoning the farmhouse that had been in our family for generations. The fear was too much. The silence of the fields was no longer peaceful. It was watching. Even after we left, I kept thinking about the scarecrows, the way they moved when no one was looking, the whispers in the night, the thing at my window. And the worst part, I never saw its face, but sometimes even now when I pass by fields in the dead of night, I get the distinct feeling that something is still watching me.